Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another random review. We're going back to 1978, can you imagine? For Jerry Skolimowski's The Shout, starring Alan Bates, Susanna York, John Hurt, Robert Stephens, Tim Curry, a young Jim Broadbent, even though he looks exactly the same as he does now, pretty much. This is from a story by Robert Graves, co-written by Skolimowski. Skolimowski, Polish writer, director, actor. He was in Cronenberg's Eastern Promises, for example. He also did Deep End, which is wonderful, and EO, which is a riff on O Hazard Balthazar, even though, to be honest, if I want to see a donkey film, I would rather just watch O Hazard Balthazar, but it's certainly worth a watch, even though you just get Balthazar nostalgia. There's also a second run box set, and there's another BFI release of some of his films, which I might have to check out. Now, if you're familiar with Skolimowski's work, not particularly bog standard, narrative driven mainstream entertainment, and The Shout is not any different from that. In some ways it's an incredible film, in other ways it's a bit daft. It's a simple story that's been told so many times. We open in an insane asylum, or a mental hospital, or a psychiatric hospital, as they're probably called nowadays. Things like Looney Bin and Barmy Factory. You're not allowed to really say those kind of things. And we're introduced to Robert Stephens, who is organising a cricket match between patients and staff and other people. And Tim Curry, looking very young, of course, is a backup scores person, and he's going to share the scoring duties with Alan Bates, who is a patient. I mean, Alan Bates did a lot of interesting films throughout his career. He doesn't really get talked about as much as his peers, but he's always worth a look, and he is fascinating in this. I don't know whether this is kind of ever mentioned among folk horror. It's not really a horror per se, but it's set in a small English village, and there is Aboriginal things that Alan Bates has learned. So as this cricket match evolves, Robert Stephens has told Tim Curry that Alan Bates is a genius and he's really learned, but there's something not quite right about him. So Alan Bates says to Tim Curry, well, you can keep both side scores and I'll tell you this little story, when he sees John Hurt, one of the cricketers. So we get flashbacks to when Alan Bates was in this small English village, really. John Hurt is married to Susanna York, and he is a composer, a musician, but he's kind of avant-garde. It's the 70s. Originally you think he's like a Foley artist, so he's like making noises and recording, nails going into wood and stuff like that. But he's a composer. He does have a little eye for one of the congregation in the church, because he's a backup organist as well for the church. Obviously it's a small village, so sometimes you have to pull double duty. And Alan Bates kind of just turns up, invites himself to lunch, and kind of tells John Hurt and Susanna York he was in Australia for a while, and he killed his children. So obviously Susanna York doesn't think that's the best icebreaker in the world. And then over the course of this visit, it becomes a little bit like Pasolini's Theorem, or the classic outsider story coming into a family and erupting it. He tells John Hurt this story that while he was in Australia, Aborigines taught him how to do this shout, as in the title of the film, that can kill. Obviously John Hurt thinks this is ridiculous, and we the audience probably think it's ridiculous as well. But as he is kind of critical of John Hurt's music, he says there's no kind of life in it, it's soulless. John Hurt wants him to perform this shout for him. Obviously Alan Bates doesn't really want to, because it would kill him, but he takes earplugs and they go down to the dunes, and he performs this shout, which has strange consequences. I mean, they went down to the beach, to the dunes, because nobody's about. Whether that's true or not, you'll have to watch the film. But from then on, the dynamic between the three of them changes, as Susanna York seems to be more drawn to Alan Bates now, which obviously John Hurt is upset about, but then he is kind of on the verge, or is messing about with a woman from the congregation, but of course that seems to be alright. Men. And every now and again we cut back to the cricket match, with strange things going on with Alan Bates and Tim Curry. It is an odd film. Again, you should really show this film to, if you know people who are just not die-hard mainstream fans, but just kind of watch mainstream films, and films are kind of, not that serious, and they're just for entertainment or whatever. You should show them the shout and see if they're really confused, because again, it is quite a lot. I haven't seen a lot of Smolowski's films, but they are kind of, you either really like them or you don't. And I'm definitely in the camp of the shout is kind of special, even though it is a bit odd. But again, incredible cast. You couldn't get a cast like that now. I mean, mainly because just about everybody in it is no longer with us. Bates has this magnetism, wearing a black, he's all in black. I mean, he has that stubble that he had for a while in the 70s and early 80s. Again, John Hurt plays somebody who's being brought into this very strange world. in a very wonderful John Hurt way. And of course it's wonderful to see a young Tim Curry in cricket gear, and if you want to see Jim Broadbent stripping off and running about in the rain, this is the film for you. Now I do think there is a Blu-ray. I think Network maybe released it on Blu-ray or at least DVD. Obviously I've just picked up the DVD, but I might have to try and find it in Blu-ray. I mean, it feels very much like, I know BFI have released some of his other stuff like EO, as I said, but it does feel like an Indicator film. It's got Indicator written all over it. But it is a fascinating piece of work. Again, not for everybody, so it's not going to topple Pharaoh from the best film of the year so far, but it's certainly a fascinating watch. Certainly an interesting film. It's only 83 minutes long. It doesn't overstay its welcome. Again, it's a very loose structure, and it is more character stuff based around this bizarre talent. Obviously if this was around today, Alan Bates would go on Britain's Got Talent and kill Simon Cowell with his shout, but sadly Alan Bates isn't around today to do that. So thanks so much for watching this random review, and it is a fairly random film. Please let me know if you've seen The Shout, or if you've heard The Shout, or if you in actual fact can perform the shout that kills. And hopefully you'll join me again for more random reviews if you haven't been arrested and put in jail for killing somebody by shouting. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films saying farewell